And this is true, but of course there are limits in terms of what the insurance companies are going to want to put into Christchurch and in terms of what we can afford as a community or individuals can afford. So I would suggest, and I'm sure there will be a huge variety of opinion on this, among the engineering fraternity as well, but generally mid-rise buildings are going to get by with cheaper foundations than the big ones. The big buildings we may end up now looking at going deeper piles, maybe all the way down to that aquifer, and having to deal with the problems of dealing with the artesian pressures. So in general, maybe mid-rise buildings is where we should be looking at in the central city. We certainly do need to plan around liquefaction, and some of the buildings have been planned around liquefaction. Most of them in the last 10 or 15 years, liquefaction has been a routine part of the foundation analysis. But we probably need to do a little bit more work in that respect. And the lateral spread, where the the ground physically moves sideways, is very difficult to engineer against. And so we need to be a little bit cautious about along the Avon. The lateral spread is not extensive. Generally it's within the riverbanks and the roads. It doesn't go into private properties very much, but certainly if you're close to that sort of area, then we have to be a bit cautious. So that's just some background information to inform the sort of ideas that might come out of this sort of exercise in terms of, yes, we might say we want to compete with Dubai, we want to build the tallest buildings in the world. We can engineer anything, yes. The tallest buildings in Dubai are all built on metres and metres and metres of sand, but maybe they don't have earthquakes quite the way we do here. And so we have to be realistic in terms of some of our visioning, in terms of what is actually practical in terms of the physical environment as well as the cultural and economic environment. So that's a little intro to the geotechnical conditions under the central city, and it's been pretty much a generalised talk, so there may be some specific questions you'd like to have.
Thank you very much, Ian. By the way, a round of applause for our sign translator, Philippa. I was extremely remiss in not introducing her earlier. Righto, rapid fire question time. We do have about 15 minutes. I'll go this side. Jenny's our runner, so just raise your hand if you've got a question. Okay, Sue, we'll start up here. 2 o'clock, Jenny.
Thank you for your presentation. I've heard some people with money or builders building property in Christchurch before the earthquake would go double the building code and their houses really haven't had a problem. I just wonder where the building code is now. Is it in limbo or is it something they're still deciding?
Work in progress. The building code is a very complex document, and it also applies to the whole of New Zealand. So a response specific to what we're facing here may not be at all appropriate for elsewhere. So we have to be cautious, first of all, that there's not a knee-jerk reaction and say we cannot build anywhere where there's liquefaction, for instance, or we have to pile every single building that might be on liquefiable ground, because there's a dollar sign that comes to that. And as a society, we have to be careful about that. The whole philosophy of structural design is that we design for a specific level of earthquake which has a probability attached to it. So typically we design for an event which might occur on average once in 500 years. And we say, what we have been saying is at that level of earthquake, the building can be damaged. We just need to make sure that it doesn't fall over and bits don't fall off it. That could endanger life. So it's life protection. After the earthquake, you might get the bulldozers in and knock it all down and start again. That's been the philosophy. There's a tendency right now to push that barrier a long way out and say we can't afford to have any buildings fall down, we can't afford the economic loss, we have to bulletproof all our buildings. But that comes with a huge dollar sign. And therefore there has to be an informed debate to actually say whether it's logical to improve it dramatically or not. It is clear on a residential scale that the standard houses that have been, foundations that have been used in Christchurch are woefully inadequate, and it's very clear that there will be requirements to do better for that. In terms of the building stock in the inner city, I think it's fine-tuning. It's not a case of holus bolus change in terms of the building code. It will be a process that will take some time. I'm in the invidious position sometimes of being asked by people for answers, and I cannot give them. This whole process, unfortunately, is going to take time. There's just no two ways about that. The problems are immense and everywhere you look. So it's just, this is where it is. We just have to be patient and wait. We're all in the same boat.
Thank you. What do we do about the water streams that have been identified that lie right across Christchurch City? Are they to be opened up or built over or continually built over as there has been?
You're talking about the stream channels which have been infilled?
Yes.
Yes. You can continue to build over them if this is an appropriate use of that land. You just need to build your foundations appropriately. So there are some buildings which were sitting on shallow foundations which have not performed well because the filled material was placed there in the early days. It wasn't properly compacted, so it's in a loose state. The earthquake shakes it and it all consolidates. So it's a case in those situations of just building appropriate foundations, maybe piles rather than shallow foundations. So there's really no reason why you can't build on those areas provided you're aware of the condition underneath.
All right, up top.
Although it's been dismissed about relocating the central city, what's your personal opinion about is the ground really any better out beyond the airport or out towards Rolleston, ending up with a twin city centre?
It's clearly, from a geotechnical perspective, it's clearly better to head west. We out there uniformly for large areas, we've got 1 to 2 metres of silty sand overlying sandy gravel, which is reasonably dense. The groundwater is a long way down. Liquefaction is not an issue. Ground damage is much less than what we're seeing here, unless you're sitting over the Greendale Fault. So from a geotechnical perspective, yes, it's a better place. But as a colleague said to me, well, if they relocate Christchurch out to Rolleston or somewhere, well, I think I'd rather go and live somewhere else. Because what are the intrinsic things that makes Christchurch attractive? For me, one of the things is the Avon River, meandering through the river, through the city. Hagley Park, the cultural aspects of the inner city that we still have, and hopefully will be repaired at least for some of them. So there's always pluses and minuses. Geotechnical issues, yes, it would have been much better if Captain Thomas had kept on going out to the other side of Dean's Bush, but this is where we are. So it's a multifaceted question. From a geotechnical perspective only, it would be much better, but for a lot of other reasons, maybe this is where we are, and we just accommodate the additional difficulties with the ground that we have in this area.
I would like to follow up on your comment on residential foundations. Could you expand on that in terms... So I'd like to expand on your comment on residential foundations. You made the comment that existing foundations have not performed well. Could you expand on I'm not a builder or an engineer, what those existing foundation methods are and what you think should be done in the future for residential foundations?
When I say about residential foundations not performing well, I was referring specifically to foundations on ground which is liquefied. And so there was publicity during this week about the City Council wanting better foundations for houses, and what they are talking about is actually specifically aimed to produce more robust foundations for liquefiable situations. We have the situation where the house may be perfectly okay above the floor level, but the floor is all out of tilted, cracked, split, and so what do? It's extremely difficult to actually repair that house without demolishing it and rebuilding from the ground up. So the idea is to produce a more robust system so that the whole thing stays intact. It may still settle, it may tilt, but you can get back and re-level that with the house still intact above it. The house stays habitable, you can come back and repair it at an economic level. And there are various solutions that can be approached in that: raft foundations, piling, a combination of things. But at present it's also a mix because the insurance companies are in there, as well as the engineering fraternity, as well as homeowners. But there are solutions that can certainly dramatically improve the resilience of house foundations.
Just an extension of that question, if that work needed to be done for residential areas, what actually happens? Does the house have to be shifted off the site for some time, or can it be done just by jacking the house up and working underneath?
That's something that is to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. Many sites there's not enough room to be able to shift it off the site and redo something. The only solution is either to lift it up, redo the foundations, or demolish and rebuild.
All right, we've got about 4 or 5 minutes left. Can you just raise your hand? We'll try and expedite this. All right, we'll start there. We'll come down the... Oh, who hasn't asked a question down here? Newbies, just to be fair. All right, Jenny, we'll take that up there, then over here, and one here.
Thank you. My question was, you mentioned in Dubai, the sands go down a long way. Could Dubai be subject to liquefaction with the sands? My second question is, you talked about the high-rises being expensive to build, and that mid-rise would be probably the way things would be going. When you talk about mid-rise, are you talking 6 stories, 7 stories? Those are my 2 questions.
I'm not an expert on Dubai, but I do know that they don't have so many earthquakes over there. And the groundwater is it's in the deserts, but they are close to the sea. I would imagine if they had a big earthquake, then Dubai could be in problems too, but I don't actually know. Your second question, mid-rise, 6 to 12 stories is you can found in the denser sand layers at around 12 to 15 metres depth. If you're going up to 25 plus, then you'd have to be looking seriously at going right down to the aquifer. So that's the sort of cut-off.
All right, we'll come over here. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I had a question about the liquefaction and the soil type that we have in Christchurch, and wondered whether you had any comment or what work was being done for comparable cities where there's liquefiable lands, soils, and in an earthquake zone. I mean, what sorts of cities are they? Are we taking lessons and talking to them about the types of design and building code features that work?
We know a lot about liquefaction because of what's happened in cities overseas. So there are many instances where liquefaction has occurred historically with large earthquakes. Christchurch is a little bit unique because we probably have a unique geology here, and we're also a bit unique in terms of the extent of the liquefaction. In other places the liquefaction has been confined to parts of the city, whereas here it's where has liquefaction not occurred? It's almost that question here in Christchurch. Secondly, our building stock is somewhat different to most places overseas, so you can't just draw on overseas experience. You have to distill that knowledge and information and apply it to the local practices and the local styles of building here. But yes, there's Mr. Kupravinovsky from the university is very much involved in this whole thing. He's worked for years in Japan. He has links internationally with people. So he's just one example of links into the international arena where we are getting ideas and knowledge from.
All right, sir.
Thank you. Look, global warming and sea level rise is predicted to happen. Is there any factors, are we taking any of that into account? This is a golden opportunity to anticipate that and not build where we're likely to get tsunamis and floods.
That's not in the CBD, but certainly it is an aspect in part of the eastern suburbs which I'm sure that the City Council and the authorities who are having to deal with this sort of question are addressing. It only makes common sense. I mean, part of the problem in parts of eastern Christchurch is that the ground has settled. I showed you a photograph there in Kilmore Street. It's dropped a third of a metre. In places in eastern Christchurch a whole lot more than that. And they had flooding problems before, so now it's a real problem. So when you start putting these things together, then you have to ask the questions about whether it's sensible to just go back and rebuild. And those questions, as I understand it, are being addressed and looked at very seriously.
All right, on that note, we're going to have to leave it there. Ian, thank you very much for a most fascinating discussion.